Starting up good old Camtasia recorder. Check testing. Okay, it looks like it's on. Let me boost my gain just a little bit more. All right. Well, hey everybody, glad to be back with you. This is our second of two OnRamp sessions, and this one is Visual Studio Code Quick Start. Looks like my mic is unmuted, my screen share is up. Just for the sake of those watching the recording after the fact, I'll briefly introduce myself. I did so formally yesterday. My name's Tim Warner. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, so I'm a couple hours ahead of you. I was at Microsoft full-time for the last year in their Learn organization, writing Azure docs and supporting training materials. I've recently come home, though, to my previous employer, Pluralsight, because I just couldn't escape my destiny. I am a teacher. I am an instructional designer more than anything else. I've been a Microsoft certified trainer for about 25 years. I was in the MVP program for a number of years, hope to get back. You can't be an MVP and a Microsoft full-timer, so you have to give that valuable award up, unfortunately. So now it's time to try to reclaim it. We'll see. You can find me on Twitter at TechTrainerTim, and my website is techtrainertim.com. All right, so we don't have a lot of time, and I have a lot that I want to share with you, so let's get to it. 3 learning goals for you here. First, I want to briefly justify why you should standardize as your code editor Visual Studio Code rather than the Windows PowerShell ISE that's baked into Windows Server and Windows Client. We'll spend the bulk of our time with the second 2 bullet points, getting you comfortable with the application. I'll give you lots of tips, tricks, and shortcuts. But we're keeping this themed to optimize your environment for PowerShell development. But because VS Code is a multi-editor, you'll find that most of the same tips and tricks you use for PowerShell development you can use for whatever else you're doing, even just text work, actually. Session materials are at timw.info VS Code 1. Remember that yesterday's session on Microsoft certification was almost like this, timw.info MS Cert 1. And similarly, this is going to point to a GitHub gist that contains a bunch of relevant links, including a link that I'll create tonight or tomorrow morning to this recording. So it's really your master takeaway from this session, all right? I'll give that link again at the end of the session if you miss it the first time around. Now, I wanted to start, like I said, by dissuading you unless you're absolutely forced to use ISE. I mean, just recently I've been in a situation where I've RDP'd into Windows Server machines that were air-gapped from the internet. So I wasn't able to quickly download VS Code, and I was happy to have a full-fledged PowerShell editor locally on that machine. That is the Windows PowerShell Integrated Scripting Environment, or ISE. Now the thing about it is, number one, Windows is key. It's a Win32 app, so it runs only on Windows. And it's also tied to the .NET framework and Windows PowerShell 5.1, which are definitely legacy technologies. Lastly, you should know that the engineering team at Microsoft who's made the ISE, I think it comes from the PowerShell development team. But anyway, does it? Okay, but if you go in the docs, the VS Code docs, there's a include file, like a header, that says that although the ISE is going to be staying in Windows Server and Windows Client for the foreseeable future, the tool is receiving only bug fix and security updates. It's not going to get any feature enhancements, all right? So it's not really new anymore, but now we've got Visual Studio Code. What does this offer? Well, number one, in keeping with Microsoft's commitment to cross-platform open source, it's cross-platform, so it runs essentially the same on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. It's free, totally free. And it's open source, which means you can inspect the source code. If you are a developer, you can contribute to the VS Code codebase, which I think is pretty cool. I want to make sure to include some nifty things like dev containers and the fact that you can run VS Code in a browser nowadays. I've had to do that in the past, actually, where I didn't have access to my work machine and needed to get to work, and I was able to get to VS Code in a pretty nifty way, just entirely over the internet in a browser. We're standardizing on PowerShell 7, cross-platform .NET Core-based PowerShell. And as I said, VS Code is a multi-language editor. Not only programming and scripting languages, you can do C# development in Visual Studio Code, but it also is great for working with data serialization formats, particularly what I do with the Azure cloud. I'm using JavaScript object notation, and more recently I've been doing a lot with Terraform, and it really doesn't matter. The key, the secret sauce you'll see, is making sure you've got the appropriate extension installed. That's really it. So these are the touch points for the rest of our sessions. Basically, this is a punch list of stuff that I don't want to forget to show you. So let me quickly study this myself for a moment, and then I'll dump out of here, and let's go over to my virtual machine that we used a bit yesterday. So briefly, how do we get VS Code installed? Well, if you want to go the old-fashioned route, you can go to code.visualstudio.com, and you can just grab this browser app will detect your OS. But if you go down here, you can go to other platforms, and depending on your OS, you can grab the latest release. Let's just focus on Windows for now. Notice that there's a user installer. This ensures that you don't have to have administrative elevation in order to install the software. So it doesn't go into C program files, it goes into app data. If you are a systems administrator and you want the software available to all user profiles and you do have administrative elevation, you can do the system installer. And notice that there's actually a zip, a portable, that you can put on a thumb drive or whatever. I'm wondering what this CLI is, honestly. I don't know. That's something I don't remember seeing before. Let me make a note to look at that. VS Code CLI ? You learn something new every day. Now, something that I've taken to doing over the last few months is having 2 installations of VS Code on my machine. I'll use the current release version for most of my work, but then sometimes I need to be in a completely different context. You can install the Insiders build side by side with the production build. They have different icons. Let me bring up my start menu down here. Hang on just a second. I'm getting confused with all my windows here. If you look down in my taskbar, I'm colorblind, so I'm just guessing. But I think this is blue. This is the standard production release of VS Code. And then I have Insiders installed side by side. What is Insiders? It's basically a nightly build. So the general guidance is you don't want to use Insiders for production work, but I've had no problems doing so. It's pre-release. Sometimes you'll see wacky behavior. I haven't yet over the last period of time, but I'm sure I will eventually. But the important point, like I said, is that it does give you the capability of having 2 completely separate contexts with different accounts and sets of extensions and settings because they're completely isolated from each other on the same machine. All right? Now, if you're more of a systems administrator, you probably want to use automation to install VS Code. My favorite package manager is Chocolatey. So let me see, how do I want to do this? I keep going back and forth. Sorry about the flashing screen. Let me bring up my editor here and actually bring up a page. If you use Chocolatey, I'll just do something like a Choco install Y VS Code, and that's it, you know what I mean? And you could use WinGet. I don't have much experience with WinGet, but VS Code is popular enough to where any package manager under the sun is going to have a build of VS Code available to you. And I know Choco also supports the VS Code Insiders, so you can automate that installation. Now, how do you set up VS Code? Let me give you a lightning tour of the interface. Mine is looking pretty white, as you can see. You'll find that Microsoft is committed to accessibility, and I as a colorblind person, I always use a color theme that's colorblind friendly. So when you first get into VS Code, your first order of business is probably going to be to load up your extensions. Over on the left-hand side, you've got what's called the activity bar, and these icons are called program icons. You can change them. If you go to the lower left, this manage gear, and you come up to themes, there's 3 types of themes you can do. There's color themes that affect the whole application. There's the file icon theme, which when you're in your editor view here, it changes the icons of different file types. And then the product theme are these guys over here. And the activity bar will start to fill out as you install certain extensions, and it can get pretty cluttered. So you can right-click in there, and you can turn on or turn off any of those programs that you don't need all the time. You can move the activity bar to the right. You know, those traditional rules apply. You'll also see that as you're working down at the very bottom, you've got a status bar that has a lot of useful integration points. For instance, when you have Git installed, Git gets picked up automatically by VS Code. You can browse to different branches. You can see at a glance what errors, warnings, and information messages you have. And again, certain extensions will populate down here on the status bar, so this can get kind of cluttered. You can right-click in there, and you can turn on and turn off options if you're just finding that stuff is getting cut off that you want to see. So let's go over to extensions, and this taps you right into the Visual Studio extension gallery. And some tips that I have for you right off the top is that there's a search syntax that starts with an @ character. If you type @ notice that you can filter and say, show me only installed extensions on this machine, for example. Or you can do @ show me popular extensions, show me ones that are enabled. A common one you might find over time, there are extensions that are getting in your way. You just don't want to uninstall them, but you want to disable them. You can filter on that. And I can take a look at the extension and enable it or uninstall it. We can also do that from this little gear that's right next to the icon. If you're not exactly sure what you're looking for, what you can do is filter by doing @ext:, and that says look only for extensions. And let's say that we were looking for PowerShell related extensions. So @ext:, PowerShell gives us a filtered list, because you know, if you don't add a filter, it's going to show not just extensions, but everything else. In other words, those different color themes I told you about, those show up in here. You can absolutely completely customize your keyboard bindings. You'll find that some people have published key maps for other applications. For example, I could look up Sublime. A lot of people, myself, I actually was a Sublime text user before VS Code. And you might really rely and have muscle memory built on those keyboard shortcuts. So notice that actually Microsoft itself has published this extension. And this would allow you to use the same key maps in VS Code. Interestingly, if you're used to using the ISE, there is an ISE mode here in VS Code that you can choose. If you use the View command palette, and I'm telling you, this is going to be 99% of the time what you're doing, either using View command palette from the menu, or if you have a keyboard shortcut. I have Alt-C, you can see it next here, where that'll just fire up this command palette, because the way that this application was designed is to not rely on buttons, but rely on keyboard shortcuts first and the menu structure second. So I tend to do a mixture of both. That's just me. But you notice here that you've got this greater than symbol. That lets you know that you're in the command palette, and you can start to type to get anywhere you need to go in VS Code. What was I going to do? I actually plumb forgot. I totally went out of my head. I was talking about keyboard bindings and mentioning Sublime Text, and then it just plumb went right out of. Oh, thank you, Jeff. Yes, that's right. Right, so in the command palette, I can type ISE, and look how it says PowerShell enable, disable. But the only, now you might not know this, but the only way this will show up is if you have the PowerShell extension. This is the other secret sauce. If I were to give you 2 or 3 secret sauces to VS Code, one is make sure you've loaded extensions to cover all the languages and themes and doodads that you want in your environment. And number 2, get really comfortable with navigating through the command palette. So once again, when I type ISE, what this PowerShell : is telling me is that these 2 commands come from that extension. And if I go down, some don't have a prefix. These are built right into VS Code. I have a bunch of GitHub extensions, so you can see that I've got those. I've got Docker and Azure extensions. So this command palette allows you to get to all of the VS Code configuration as well as all of your extension configuration. You see what I mean? So it takes us back to extensions and making sure at the very least you have the PowerShell extension installed. Now, as you can see, there is a canonical Microsoft provided extension, and this is what I would recommend that you use. There is also a nightly type preview. Actually, it says this one is deprecated. Use the PowerShell extension instead. It used to be that if you wanted to live dangerously and see the beta features, you could load up this PowerShell preview one from Microsoft, but it looks like now they've baked it into the release where you could switch to the pre-release version. I'm not a fan of doing that. I got kind of sick of dog fooding at Microsoft because at Microsoft you can dog food literally everything on your computer, at least in terms of Microsoft software. And if you don't know what dog fooding means, it's a software development term that means using the products that you're making. And Microsoft certainly does that. So we can see that there's a bunch of, I forgot his name, Adam Driscoll makes these PowerShell Pro Tools, which are cool. So you'll find that there's a lot of community support here in terms of PowerShell. Sometimes people will package multiple extensions together into packs, like Justin here. I think he was one of my colleagues at Microsoft, actually. He's put together what he thinks is an essential collection of PowerShell extensions, and I would actually agree. Especially if you're using Git and GitHub, this GitHub pull requests and issues is critical, very important. Why? Because it gives you immediate insight into all of your issues and pull requests and reviews that you're doing. YAML, if you're doing work with YAML, there's a JSON extension for JSON, multiple. I love this Markdown all-in-one if you work in Markdown a lot. And again, if you're working in GitHub, chances are you're using Markdown as well. This has a whole bunch of conveniences baked into it. Like, for instance, one I use all the time is it makes it easy to make Markdown web links. You can put your link into your clipboard and then select text in your Markdown document and do Control-V, and it'll create the square brackets and the parentheses for you. Just little conveniences. You see what I mean? A very popular icon pack is VS Code icons here. There's a few of them you'll find. And if you just want to look for the highest rated, like I said, you can come in here and you can look under popular and just start browsing and seeing what are most people in the world downloading. And this is probably the 80% scenario of the VS Code user base, really, when you think about it. I'm not surprised that Python is number 1 and C# is in the top 10. Docker, Git, and it goes on from there, okay? So you're going to go through and at the least have PowerShell. If you want to make your environment not only look better but be more functional for you, you'll also want to load up some icons, some different icons and also color themes. And you can do that again either by going to the gear in the lower left. I could go Themes, Color Theme, and this will show me all the ones I've got installed. Or I could come over here, and here's another tip for you. You can start to type @THE, and notice that there's a syntax @category:"themes." And then if I'm looking for colorblind, for example, I can just add colorblind, you see? So I can just browse from here. And these are going to be either from Microsoft or a third-party business or a contributor. You can actually, if you're so inspired, create something and submit it into the Visual Studio Gallery so that other people can download it. So note that you can contribute to this in a really important way. So if I want to install the theme, I can click Install, and if I want to set the color theme, I can set it, and then I can just go about my happy business. Now let's say that's not good. I want to switch it. I'll bring up my command palette and just start to type color. And we see Preferences, Color Theme. And then again, we come back to my installed color themes that are divided into dark and high contrast. I like to use my GitHub colorblind themes. So I'm going to type colorblind, and I've been using the GitHub light colorblind. So I'll reset it back to that. Now, as far as the icons go, originally, I naively thought that that was just part of being a power user. You want cool looking icons. But I actually use these, and I find that choosing a good, clear, especially as I get older, that using a good, clear icon set can be really useful. For example, you see my PowerPoint decks show up with an honest-to-goodness PowerPoint icon. My Markdown files show up with an M+. See, so this is really functional. It really is. All the different file types light up. Now, what icon theme am I actually using? I don't really know. I could bring up the command palette and start to type icons, it looks like I'm using VS Code icons right now. But then we can just go ahead and change. Material icons is another icon pack that's pretty popular. That would be, I'll just assign that to you for homework to go through the extension. And you can do the same thing. You'll find that when you install certain extensions, it'll get populated over here, like I said before. And if you feel that these icons are too difficult to understand, you can come down, for example, and look for product icons. And you can browse product icons either by going into the extension marketplace, or you could come over here. This isn't as useful because you actually have to click an entry and it's just going to immediately want to install it. I would actually go through the extensions marketplace. And as you can see, this one wouldn't be a good fit for me. It's too monochromatic. But that's something that I'd like you to consider. Look at over on the left how it's changing those product icons. So we've got product icons, file icons, and color themes. Any questions, comments, concerns, curiosities so far? Let me pause and take a breath. With me so far? Good deal. Okay. So let's proceed. What about keyboard stuff? I mentioned that this interface is optimized really. I mean, I know a lot of people that are just wizards, keyboard and all over the place. I guess I'm not a curmudgeon certainly, but I still use the mouse an awful lot. Let me show you how to set keyboard bindings. The trick here is figuring out what command it is that you're trying to invoke. For example, there's a default key map for command palette. I think it's something like Control-Shift-P. And on my computer, I already mapped that to Snagit. That's the key combination I use to take screen captures. So I wanted to change this key binding because I was running into conflict problems with VS Code. We can go to View Command Palette and start to type keyboard shortcuts. Now, one thing you're going to see about the settings structure in VS Code is that you can either look at the settings in raw JSON, because fundamentally all of your settings are stored in a series of JSON documents. But there's also a graphical front end to each. So it depends on what your preferences are. Maybe to get started, you can do the graphical approach. But you'll find here, and by the way, you can close any of these panes by just clicking. Over here in the activity bar, you can toggle it on or off if you want to give yourself more space. So this is the keyboard shortcuts list. And if you want to see what the JSON looks like, you can flip between the two views over here in the upper right, and that'll show the JSON. Because like I said, under the hood, all of your VS Code settings, we can see the path up here actually. It's under, I did a user install rather than an administrative install. So I've got C users, Tim, app data roaming code user, keybindings.json. So one nice way to protect and save all of your precious VS Code settings is to just make sure you periodically back up your user folder, and that'll capture a number of JSON files, not just key bindings, but all of your other settings as well. I will mention shortly, though, that if you're using multiple computers, the most convenient way to synchronize all of your settings and extensions and key bindings is to use Settings Sync. If you use the gear in the lower right, you can turn Settings Sync on, and what happens under the hood is you have to have a GitHub account. It doesn't have to be a free account, but you do have to be on GitHub. Under the hood, it'll take all those JSON files, create private gists out of them, put them out on GitHub, and that way, when you're on another machine, you turn on Settings Sync, sign into the same GitHub account, and it'll fetch and download those JSON files. It's a beautiful way. Once you've got your master set of settings and extensions and bindings and icons to keep that environment consistent regardless of your computer. And I've had this work just fine even on Mac and I don't use Linux too much, but I'm a daily Windows and Mac user. And no problem. You'll find as you dive deeper in the settings that you can store both Mac OS and Windows directory paths, so it's not a big deal at all. Let me come back. Actually, let me take a look. Let's look at the JSON here to really get under the hood. So a key binding at base is going to be a certain key combination, and then it's going to be this dot notated path Workbench is a common one that basically denotes the whole application. And then action, and then you've got specific actions. Remember I said that the biggest trick to doing keyboard shortcuts is figuring out exactly what it is that you want to modify. And what you should know is that if you want to modify the command palette, it's actually called show commands. That took me longer than I want to admit to find originally, because let's go back to the graphical view here. If you try looking for palette, it's not here. If you try to look for command palette, it's not here. It's really annoying, but if you look for show all commands and spell it correctly, we can see that in this case there's multiple bindings. So that's something else you can do, is have multiple bindings for a given command. I've got the original Control-Shift-P, and I also have Alt-C. And when you're in the graphical editor, if you want to change the binding, you can just go and hit the little pencil, and you're prompted to choose your desired key combination. Well, let me try one that I know is being used elsewhere. I'll try Control-T. And notice that it says one existing command has this key binding. So eventually, I guarantee you're going to run across the situation where you really want to set a particular binding for a particular VS Code action, and it's already being used, and you're going to say, I don't care. I'm going to burn the other bindings to the ground. Sometimes I've had to burn like 4 or 5 bindings to the ground. Now you might be thinking, how could there be more than one other binding for a single key press? Well, that gets a little bit confusing, because remember I mentioned that the workspace or the workbench scope refers to the whole application? Well, the next level down in that hierarchy is called the workspace. And then within the workspace, you have individual folders and files and your actual projects. And you can set different key combinations and even different preferences at different scopes. So that's why it's possible to have the same key binding in VS Code in multiple scopes, because of that hierarchy. So let me click one existing command has this key bar. Looks like go to symbol in workspace. So what can I do here? I can right click and I can remove the key binding. I can change it. Another thing that you can do with these, this is beyond our scope, pun intended, is that you can get even more granular. Like we could set this particular command such that Control-T will do go to symbol when you've got PowerShell files up. You see what I mean? So VS Code actually lets you get right down into conditional logic with these things. So you can say, I want this command to be available only in a particular workspace that I'm in, and I've got a PS1 or a PSM or some PowerShell related file up. Just check the VS Code docs for that on key bindings, and you can get all the info you want on that. I'm going to right click and I'm going to remove that key binding, and then I can just look up show all commands again, and I can say nope, I'm going to do Control-T, press enter, and I've got myself a new binding. I'm going to now do Control-T, and I've got the command palette. And so that is global across the entire application. Now, without further ado, let's talk about general settings, because that's something else that's critically important. If we go to View, Command Palette, and just start to type Settings, we're going to see Open Settings UI, Open User Settings JSON, Open User Settings. So you've got application-wide. Actually, let me think about this for a second, because I'm actually a little bit confuzzled. Because if you come down here, there's default settings. That's the way VS Code comes out of the box, so you can compare or run a diff against your settings versus inbox. Here's where you're setting workspace specific, and then folder settings. I'm trying to think now offhand about user settings versus just open settings. It's going out of my head, but it doesn't really matter. We can just look at user settings. Notice that there's still the JSON, or you could go to the graphical interface. And here are some common ones that I'll normally set right off the top. Right here under commonly used, actually. We've got, do you want your documents, your open editors, do you want to have autosave? I absolutely do that, and I set it to after delay. And there's another property here that you can set the autosave delay. Let me see where that is, if it's in here. We could always look at it. Let me just do a search here for auto save. There it is. So that's again a good tip here. that if you can just get a fragment of the setting that you're interested in, look it up, and then hopefully you can find it quickly. So every second, it looks like, VS Code is going to save changes in your open editors. I like that a lot, because then otherwise when you're closing an editor tab, you'll be prompted, do you want to save your changes? No, I want everything to be saved automatically. And sometimes you'll choose an option that's generic enough to where it shows up in multiple contexts. So in this case, it's under autosave is under commonly used. It's under the text editor category as well, which makes sense because we're dealing with the editors. But notice that the Python extension, which I have installed, also has a relevant setting. So this settings UI is going to affect all of the built-in VS Code settings, and then it will be extensible as you add more and more extensions to your VS Code environment. All right? So let me go back to commonly used and get rid of my search string. You'll want to adjust your fonts and sizes, right? So you've got editor font family, and if you set it here, the terminal, which you can bring up in the upper right, these panel buttons, I use these all the time. Particularly the second one, I use it to bring up my terminal down below. That when you add font entries here, the terminal inherits. Now you could also do a search if you wanted it to set it differently. You could do a search, say, for terminal font, and I actually do have it overridden here with some different choices. And it's just like a HTML page where it starts. If you don't have this font on your system, it'll go to the second one, because that's especially important if you're on multiple computers. You want to make sure that you don't get font substitution and get really ugly looking fonts and characters. Notice that you've got a terminal font size, and you also have an editor font size as well that shows up under commonly used. But you know what I do? Here's my pro tip. I do scroll zoom. I like that a lot. There's a property called zoom scroll or scroll zoom. I can never remember exactly what it is. There it is. So in the editor category, mouse wheel zoom. And the reason I like that and I use that all the time is I'm trying to find a good file to use this on. I can hold down the control key and just zoom in and zoom out. So that setting means a whole lot to me, mouse wheel zoom. Something that gets in my way sometimes is the minimap, but when you're going in really long PowerShell files, it can be really helpful. So I'll close up my Explorer here to give myself some more screen real estate. But sometimes I do want that minimap on, and it does default to being on. You could create a keyboard shortcut for this as well. If you open up Command Palette and look up Mini, you can toggle the minimap on or off. And I found that if you create ASCII blocks, you know where you create blocks like with all the hash things? If you create big old ugly hash key blocks to separate your script, it makes it a lot easier for them to show up over here on the minimap. And a project that I'm working on myself is I'm trying to figure out, I haven't yet gotten there, but I'm trying to figure out a way to make this minimap selection rectangle have better contrast. Because again, as a colorblind dude, I have to click and fumble over here to try to find where the selection rectangle is, and it really annoys the heck out of me, to be honest. So this is a multi-editor view. So notice that I can either drag and drop multiple files out here, or I can just click them. There's actually a setting that controls whether this is multi, or if I were to click one file, it would replace the active one. I don't like that at all. I like them showing up in a multi-tab view or a multi-editor view. What this guy is up here, I use this all the time, especially when I was at Microsoft. You may find yourself working in one or more folders that have who knows how many files in them. And yes, you can do this search over here to search and potentially do search and replace throughout all of the files and folders that are in your editor. But this guy up here does the same thing. So I can start to type emp, for instance, and it immediately gives me the emp files that are in my workspace. Think Control F also will get you there. No, Control F is where you've got a whole bunch of tabs and allows you to easily browse among them. So, you know, if you're one of those people that in your web browser you've got 30 tabs, and you're in VS Code and you have a whole bunch of tabs, Control F at least gives you a vertical view of them. And similarly, to clean up your tabs, you can right-click an editor tab, and you can do close to the right, you can do close others, you can do close all to clean everything up. Something else I do a whole lot is, in this case, I'm going to use toggle panel to get rid of my terminal. If I'm doing diffs or if I need to do side-by-side work, you can just drag and drop. So I can take this file and drag it over here to the right, and now I've got a dual pane view here. And if I want this guy to go down below, looks like it's assuming I just want to do a horizontal layout. But you can adjust these controls up here. There is toggle secondary, and then the customize layout allows you to adjust the view in different ways. It just occurred to me, what I'll normally do, like if I wanted settings on the left, price data on the right, and polybase down below, I'll right click and I'll choose split down. That's actually what I do. I use the keyboard. So right click, split down, and it goes across just that side. But I could always drag this guy back here. So I just want you to know you've got almost infinite flexibility in terms of moving these different editor tabs around. I love it. And speaking of which, let's say you're working on a long-standing project. Let me right click and do a split right, in which you've got in your Explorer, you've got open editors, you've got them displayed in different layouts. You might actually have more than one folder, because you can always do a file, open folder. There's also a command to add folder to workspace. That's where I'm getting at next, by the way, the concept of the workspace. When you add a folder and create a workspace, I'm going to choose this, one of my favorite songs, How Deep Is Your Love by the Bee Gees. I've got a transcription there. I'm bringing that in as another folder along my DP900. But notice it now says Untitled Workspace. This is an important secret sauce for you to understand. When you're working on a longer running project, particularly when you're going to have more than one folder, it's a good idea for you to create a workspace. So instead of just doing File, Add Folder, do File, Add Folder to Workspace, and then watch this. You can save the workspace under a separate file name. So I could do Save, I could do File, Save Workspace As. I'll put it on my desktop. I'll just leave the default name. And then I can exit out of VS Code and reboot my computer and do an update or whatever else it is that I'm doing. And here's my workspace file. I'll double left click it. I'll open it in VS Code, and it's going to reconstitute everything. All the folders that I've added to the workspace, as well as my editor layout and all that good stuff. Isn't that wonderful? I'm going to go one step further. Let's say you're working on a long-standing project and you've created a workspace like so. You've got your folder and file structure. You've got this. Remember I mentioned that you can actually create settings that are specific to the workspace. So I can come back into my settings panel. You'll notice also that when you bring up the command palette, your most recently used commands show up at the top, and that's really convenient. I like that a lot. We can go back to our settings over here. It's kind of cramped, admittedly. I can also move the panes around by just dragging and dropping like so. But now that I'm in the settings, actually that's not what I wanted. I can go back to command palette and type workspace settings, and I can get an entirely separate set of settings and use either the JSON or the graphical editor. And now anything I make in terms of changes is going to be saved as metadata in my workspace file. Isn't that great? So you can have multiple very different customized environments by using workspaces. And doing big time search and replaces, when I was at Microsoft, I sometimes had to do find and replaces across thousands of files. A lot of that work I actually did in VS Code, because this guy up here allows you to do search and replace using your traditional controls like match case and match whole word. But does anybody, well, I was going to say, does anybody know what the dot star means? But if you can see that tooltip, you know what it says, regular expressions. So you can actually write regular expression syntax to make really targeted search and replace decisions. But here's a tip for you. Let's say that you've got a folder structure with who knows how many hundreds or thousands of files, and you don't want to use this search control because it's going to go through them all. You can actually find the folder level where you want to start your search, right-click, and do a find in folder, you see? So now you have the same search and replace controls, including regular expressions, that'll still powerfully go through however many files you have in that hierarchy, but you're not having to scrape through a much larger data volume that you otherwise would have to. Alrighty? Okay, let me pause again. Questions, comments, what's on your mind about this so far? What impressions? Thank you. Yes. Yes. Let's do a new file. Let's say we're doing some PowerShell development, and I'm going to do a file from dead scratch. There is a setting where you can adjust the default file format. So if we go back to our settings and we look up default file, that'll probably get us there. Yeah, the default language setting right here. I have mine set to plain text. If you're really doing predominantly PowerShell, you could do that. I have plain text and assume that the files are plain text. You can look in the lower right and the language mode says plain text. But watch this. When I save the file using an extension a file extension that a VS Code extension understands, watch this. I'll do PS1. Notice that down in the lower right, the PowerShell extension invoked the language mode and set it to PowerShell. The icon shows up as a PowerShell icon. It brings up the integrated terminal environment down below. All of that heavy lifting is coming by virtue of the PowerShell extension, and that also now gives us IntelliSense code completion. So as I start to type new self-signed certificate, I'm going to get IntelliSense, not only in my case from the PowerShell extension, but I also have GitHub Copilot installed. Now we're not going to have time to go into that tonight, but that can help you learn PowerShell, and it can definitely shorten the time it takes for you to write PowerShell because it comes up with all sorts of suggestions. In fact, look here. As soon as I typed new self-signed certificate and paused my mouse, GitHub Copilot is volunteering to complete this. And I can press tab or use this little mini toolbar. And now I've got myself at least the stub of a usable command. And it goes a lot further than that. I might do something like this. Function, install IIS, and then open up a function block. And GitHub Copilot is trying to complete that function for me. And it's not doing as robust of a job as I was expecting, to be honest with you. But that's just something I want to mention in passing. So what are some other configurations specifically to PowerShell that I come off the top of my head? The PowerShell extension actually has an integrated terminal. It's not the default PowerShell 7 environment. You can customize all of that down below on the status bar. Let me right-click first of all and make sure I've got everything I need. I'm seeing the PowerShell language mode. What I'm expecting to see is the PowerShell session option, and it's getting kind of cut off. You see when I hover over it, it says that right now that my terminal is running PowerShell 7.3.4, and then I can click this Show PowerShell Session menu, and this allows you to override the default PowerShell engine that you're using. Where do you think you would customize that if you wanted to set VS Code to use Windows PowerShell by default instead of PowerShell 7? Where do we go in VS Code to do that? Anybody? Yeah, right. It's a leading question, but sometimes I forget to ask questions, and that's not good. Absolutely. If we do a search in the command palette for PowerShell, we're going to see that PowerShell has a whole bunch of options, over 50. And we don't have time to go through them all, but they're documented. You can go into the MS Learn docs. If I do a search for PowerShell version, this is where we can specify our default PowerShell version as well, and even whether you want to be prompted to update. Or you could use Jeff's PS Release Tools module, which I still use, by the way, to update to the latest version of the PowerShell engine. Okay, another tip. The PowerShell extension has a built-in debugger, which could be really useful as you get deeper with your PowerShell work. And there's actually a really nice tutorial file that the PowerShell extension ships with. So watch this. If we again go back to the command palette and we type PowerShell example, Is my computer locking up again? Yeah, you can see it right here. PowerShell Open Examples folder. That's what the setting is. So let me choose Open Examples folder. And in there, there's a whole bunch of sample files that show off different capabilities of both PowerShell and VS Code. The one I want to assign to you is debugtest.ps1. And this one here just has some simple, in fact, it's commented, where it tells you on line 10 here, on the gutter on the left, right-click and add a breakpoint. So it walks you through traditional debug operations, like setting a breakpoint, and then you have the ability, like you normally do in a debug environment, to run and then it'll stop at the breakpoint. Let me actually try that. In the gutter to the left, choose Add Conditional Breakpoint, and then for the condition, say whenever the I variable is equal to 25, stop execution. And then we can run, and we've got our traditional debug controls here where you can step over and step into and restart. And if we go over to the debug pane, which I actually don't have, do I have it visible? No, I didn't. So let me open the Run and Debug pane. This will show you, I might have to restart that actually. This will show you variable value. You can watch variable values change as calls are happening within your code. Those will show up. I'm wondering off the top why this isn't populating. It's showing my breakpoint, but you can customize the parameters of your debug environment using JSON-based what are called launch configuration files. So this is, again, just a nice feature that's baked into the PowerShell extension itself. You'll find other languages don't have this. The Microsoft PowerShell team, working in conjunction with the VS Code people, I think did a really nice job at that integration. All right, let me go back to PowerPoint and see if there's any deal breaker stuff I want to make sure to cover before we wrap it up. I think I've done a pretty good job. How about just setting sync? If I come back to VS Code, you might spend quite a bit of time setting up your ideal environment, like I've said before. You can go down here and go to Turn on Setting Sync. Choose if you want to install, if you want to sync everything or just selected things. Notice that it picks up your settings, your keyboard shortcuts, your UI state, your layout, your extensions, your profiles. You just need to sign in to GitHub and turn it on, and it'll go. Oh yeah, that's right. That makes sense. Given that Microsoft owns GitHub, it would make sense that GitHub supports federated ID with the Microsoft identity in addition to the GitHub identity. Yeah, but that can be awfully. Yeah, there's definitely some warts. One that I'm contending with now, honestly, is that I'm using two separate GitHub IDs, and it's a pain in the neck. Even having two separate VS codes, I find that when I'm signed in with my personal GitHub on one VS code, I go over to my Pluralsight GitHub, and it's still thinking that I'm using my personal account. It's a royal pain in the neck. So what I'm doing, it's kind of a workaround, is that when I need to switch context, in the terminal, I'll use the GitHub CLI. That's something that you should probably look at, the GitHub CLI, if you're going to be working with GitHub. And there's a command, ghauth login, and you just do a quick browser login with your correct account, and then you should find that you can push and pull and do the things in the context that you want. But I'm getting increasingly annoyed that I haven't found a more elegant solution to that, but that's another story for another time. In closing, questions, comments, concerns? I'll speak now or you know the rest. Okay. All right, I'll do that, Jeff. And also, everybody, make a note of that session materials link, timw.info, VS Code 1. And I'll stop recording now.